Good evening, everyone, and welcome to WOW Live, Word on Wednesdays Live. It's great to have you joining with me online tonight. We're going to get further into Walt Brown's Hyrdroplate Theory tonight. I just wanted to mention a little bit about how I found out about Walt Brown. I first saw him on a movie that I'd gone to see, a documentary at the theater. Who goes to see documentaries at theaters? I do. Sun Pictures, in fact, put it out. I think it was in the 1970s, if I remember rightly, or maybe early 80s. And it was on In Search of Noah's Ark, or something like that it was called. And they had a segment on where Dr. Brown presented his theory about what happened, and I was enthralled. They had a very ancient form of computer animation of the whole theory, and he explained things as it was going along and describing what happened, and a very interesting segment. You can find that segment actually on YouTube if you look a little bit. And then later I found out he had a whole book on this called In the Beginning, and it covers everything in his theory that he had at the time, and he kept updating it. In fact, I think it's updated still online. I'm not entirely sure of that, but at his website, which I should have had for you, but I don't right now. Not Creation Science, it's something else. I wasn't prepared for any of this kind of stuff. Let me just see if information is on here. I'm sure it is somewhere. Lots of good support for what people are saying, and Let's see. Okay, what is creation science? What do you know? www.creationscience, all one word.com. So creationscience, all one word.com. And so it's an interesting theory. So we want to get into that tonight, back into it. Last week we dug down deeply into his theory, and I purposefully went into more detail than perhaps you all might have needed or even wanted to hear. But my hope with this is that you'll see how Dr. Brown put a great deal of thought and investigation into his description of the causes for the great flood of Noah's time, as well as the results of that flood and what it brought about. And I hope you can also see how, compared to secular thinking, this biblically driven hydroplate idea offers a better explanation, in my humble opinion, for what we see in our world today than does that other theory. Okay? I covered a lot of material last time dealing with the physical state of things leading up to the initiation of the flood, how there were water chambers that God put below the surface of the earth, below the crust, and moving on from there. So what I want to do quickly is review things that we covered in kind of short way, and then get into that initiation phase, that flood initiation phase, which started everything, which Dr. Brown calls the rupture phase. And then we'll move into the other phases, hopefully covering, well, we won't cover all of them tonight, but we will get through 3 of them, and that'll give you a good overview of how things worked. We talked last time about the word firmament. I found another source for the definition of the word firmament, which basically confirms what we learned from Dr. Brown. This is from the website WordSense, and I looked up information for the Latin word firmamentum, which is where our word firmament actually comes from. And it actually comes to us via the Bible and the verses we've been looking at, the 1611 translation of the King James Version, to be exact. They took the word from the Latin Vulgate, firmamentum, and used that to create the word firmament for their translation. So that's where that comes from. And firmamentum is defined on this page as from firmo, meaning strengthen, which is from firmus, firm, okay? Literally, that which strengthens or supports. The meaning of a strengthening, a support, a prop. And talking about the broader meaning, the cosmological sense, it says, is coined in the Vulgate in imitation of the Septuagint stereoma, firm or solid structure, which in turn translates the Hebrew rakia. Some have viewed this as a mistranslation, and the modern New American Standard Bible translates this as expanse, based on a modern scientific bias. However, ancient Hebrews, including those who translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, or the LXX, that's the Latin word for 70, understood this term to refer to solid material. Hence, the Septuagint stereoma, or firm or solid structure. The Hebrew rakia refers to a hard substance that has been hammered out by craftsmen. So you might remember looking at the blacksmith who had the blade that he was working on, knife blade perhaps or whatever, sword blade, and he had it red hot and he had the hammer in hand there on the anvil, right? In the previous lesson, using the New King James Version as my biblical source for Genesis 1 verses 6 and 7, I substituted the phrase spread out solid object for the word firmament. And like this, verses 6 and 7, Genesis 1, then God said, let there be a spread out solid object in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Thus God made the spread out solid object, and divided the waters which were under the spread out solid object from the waters which were above the spread out solid object, and it was so. So, the firmament, the rakia, according to Dr. Brown, would have been the granite crust which at the very beginning covered the entire planet. There was water below the crust and also water above it. What's described here in verses 6 and 7 would have looked like this. The image on the lower right corner there, that circle within a circle, the concentric circles representing a cutaway of the earth, right? In this diagram of how the earth may have looked right after the creation activity in Genesis 1 and verse 7, which we just read, in this you can see the water layer above the firmament there, the firmament being the brown circle, of course, and the water layer, the blue layer, below it. At that point, at that moment, the entire planet was covered with water. Remember, the Spirit hovered over the face of the deep. But it wasn't going to stay covered like that, because next God would cause the land to appear. Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. So that's water below the heavens. That's below the atmosphere. Okay. God caused portions of the earth's crust, also known as the firmament, to drop down to the mantle. You see this sort of suede look there, not suede like leather, kind of a ripple sort of a look, I guess. I think it was swayback horse or something, where you saddle up on the low part, right, where the pre-flood sea's sitting. Okay, he had that drop down to the mantle, while other portions he raised up above the surface water. So you can see how Psalm 75 and verse 3, which is down there in the gray area, the mantle foundation, describes God setting the pillars of the earth. It says there, it is I who have firmly set its pillars. These pillars created thousands of underground interconnected water chambers, subterranean water chambers. Psalm 33 verse 7 says, God lays up the deep in storehouses. Okay, most of the weight of the granite crust was now resting upon those water chambers. That water was under tremendous pressure, and so it had a kind of a waterbed effect, for want of a better term, to kind of sustain that firmament. That it rested on the pillars some, but most of it rested on the water. Last time I spoke to you about the fall of man in sinning against a holy God. Happened in Genesis 3. This rebellion brought a curse upon the created order. And I believe that among other things that were weakened by that curse, there was, a weakening of the planet. as increased entropy, which is the running down of things, the wearing down and the loss of well, it's not really a loss of energy, but a change of energy where everything is given off in a useless form of heat and can no longer be regained. And so that's what entropy is, where energy just starts all converting to heat eventually. And it's the law of thermodynamics, the dynamics of heat. Okay, is what we're talking about there. And this is kind of the second law of thermodynamics, that entropy is going to increase. And that was introduced into the creation in a much stronger sense than what it may have been before the fall. All right, and things then began to break down. You know, you're going to eat this and you're going to die, right? And so death is introduced, and the breaking down of other things as well. And we talked last time about the tidal pull of the moon, creating this action called tidal pumping that moved the crust and especially the water in those underground chambers, moving everything up and down. And this up and down motion increased the water pressure, and it raised the water temperature to boiling. You can see the redness on those 4 sample pillars on that diagram. The pillars began to heat up with this motion from this tidal pumping, the turning of the earth and the gravity pull of the moon moving around on the planet. Ordinarily, boiling water causes steam, right? As liquid water converts to vapor and steam is given off from the pot on the stove or whatever. But in this case, with the weight of that granite crust, everything is contained. It's all contained, and the water has no place to go, so the steam has no place to go. And when the underground water in those chambers passed the critical temperature of 705 degrees Fahrenheit, now bear in mind 212 Fahrenheit is where water begins to boil, but it gets to 705, the water entered a state there called supercritical, meaning it went beyond that critical point. The temperature went up. It was highly active, this H2O, constantly changing back and forth between liquid and gas. Some is liquid, some is gas, and then it reverts and it's going back and forth. It's under extreme pressure, and it's building up pressure. It was only a matter of time before something was going to give way. And Genesis 7:11 says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. This was the beginning of the global catastrophe that we know as Noah's flood. In his Hyrdroplate Theory, Dr. Brown calls this initial stage of the flood the rupture phase. And he explains, centuries of tidal pumping powerfully increased the pressure in the subterranean water. This stretched the overlying crust just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. The balloon's going to break at some point. This is why he's using that balloon metaphor. Eventually, this shell of rock reached its failure point. Failure began with a microscopic crack at the Earth's surface, and that's why I have that slide there. Because stresses in such cracks are concentrated at each end of the crack, each end grew rapidly. That's where the tension always is, on either end. He says it spread at about 3 miles per second. Within seconds, this crack penetrated 60 miles down to the subterranean chamber, and then it followed the path of least resistance around the Earth. The rupture probably completed its path around the Earth in about 2 hours. Initial stresses were largely relieved when one end of the crack ran into the path left by the other end. In other words, the crack traveled a path that intersected itself at a large angle, forming a T or possibly a Y, somewhere on the opposite side of the Earth from where the rupture began. Okay, and while this crack was rapidly spreading around the globe, this 60-mile thick crust ripped open like a tightly stretched cloth. The pressure in the subterranean chamber suddenly dropped to nearly the same as the atmospheric pressure on Earth. So it's opened up now a little bit, and so all the pressure is released, and it's about equal to atmospheric pressure, but instantly almost. And that tremendous drop in pressure, excuse me, on this chamber of highly pressurized supercritical water. Excuse me, I'm losing my place here. I think I went past something. There we go. That this highly supercritical water exploded the water to the surface with great force. Right, the water came gushing up through that 50-mile deep slit at supersonic speeds. And the slit wrapped the planet like the seam of a baseball, as you see there with that mid-oceanic ridge on the map. Dr. Brown continues his description of this rupture phase. All along this globe-circling rupture, whose path approximates today's mid-oceanic ridge, which I think that's where I need to be. Okay, yeah, I missed a slide entirely there. Sorry. But anyway, here's where we're at. All along this globe-circling rupture, whose path approximates today's mid-oceanic ridge, a fountain of water jetted supersonically. Okay, let's go back and look at that. There's the fountain of water, okay, going up. It jetted supersonically into and far above the atmosphere. And here on this you can see the mid-oceanic ridge encircling the Earth on that map. He goes on, much of the water fragmented into an ocean of droplets that fell as rain great distances away. This produced torrential rains such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. Okay, so it rained like you've never seen it rain before. 40 days and 40 nights of torrential downpour. All this water coming, you see, from underground and going up into the atmosphere and then falling back down all over the Earth. Some jetting water rose above the atmosphere where it froze, and then fell on various regions of the Earth as huge masses of extremely cold, muddy hail. That hail buried and suffocated and froze many animals, including some mammoths. You know, there were some of these frozen mammoths in Siberia that they found. They cut them open. In their stomachs, they found buttercups. In other words, these animals were eating summer kind of flora, okay, and then suddenly massive amounts of ice dumped on them and froze them solid. How much does it take to freeze an elephant? Did you ever think about that? What temperature would you have to be at? This stuff was super cold ice that dumped on these creatures and just froze them as they were trying to escape. Anyway, this particular one, this is back to what Dr. Brown is writing now. This is the most famous of all mammoths, the frozen Berezovka mammoth. He's displayed in the Zoological Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia, in the struggling position in which he was found near Siberia's Berezovka River, just inside the Arctic Circle. His trunk and much of his head, reconstructed in this display, had been eaten by predators before scientists arrived in 1901. Just think about that. Predators back at the turn of the last century are in there eating a woolly mammoth. All right. After a month of excavation, 10 pony-drawn sleds hauled most of his cut-up carcass more than 2,000 miles south to the Trans-Siberian Railroad. From there, he was taken to St. Petersburg's Zoological Museum, today's leading institution for studying frozen mammoths. The handle, extreme bottom center, which I put a little yellow arrow there for you to see, of the shovel used in the excavation provides the scale. So you have an idea there with a snow shovel, right? How big this guy actually is. So we can see how the rupture at the Earth's surface explosively initiated the Great Flood, blasting water, mud, and rock at supersonic speeds, much of it going up above the atmosphere, falling down cold, freezing the mammoths and everything. Speeds from out of the depths of the ground. This is where the water was coming from underground. These underground chambers as it exploded forth under all that pressure. Now, according to the hydroplate theory, from the rupture phase, the flood event moved into what Dr. Brown calls, well, the flood phase. The picture on this slide really doesn't represent the reality very well. Each rock wall on either side of the rupture was actually about 60 miles high. Also, the picture doesn't really show it, but massive amounts of water are still gushing from the underground. Maybe not as much as the rupture phase shown here, but the water was still rushing out of that huge canyon, which was now spread all over the earth. That rupture that went all over the place. And the water is spreading out too and flooding the surface. Think for a moment of your house's plumbing system. If you've ever had a shut-off, or if you have ever shut off, I should say, a valve, closed it, that suddenly stops the flow of water through the pipe, you may have heard a loud bang, and the pipes shudder at that bang, and they shake. That's called a water hammer. And it happens because the energy from the running water is suddenly stopped, and the energy is driven back through that now stopped water. Like the collision of a train with a solid object, every car in the train experiences the effect almost instantaneously as the energy flies back from that collision through the train itself along the tracks and everything else. And the faster and more massive the volume of water, the greater the pressure jump through the pipe. And Dr. Brown writes this now in his book, talking about this effect, this water hammering effect. The subterranean chamber acted as the pipe, all that water around the earth. What was the valve? What closed it off? Once the water began to escape upward through any crack, a chain reaction would begin. The escaping flow from the chamber would start collapsing pillars, beginning with those nearest the crack. So these pillars are collapsing now. Adjacent pillars, suddenly carrying additional loads, would not be able to hold it, and they would also collapse like a house of cards. The crust would vibrate in complex wave-like patterns, like a flag held horizontally in a strong wind. Can you hear the flapping of that flag and watch the thing flutter in the wind? And as it's held out horizontally, in other words, parallel to the ground, basically, with the wind. Each narrowing of the chamber's thickness would, in effect, partially close a valve, slow trillions of tons of water, and create a massive water hammer. Okay? So just imagine the sound of all of this underground activity. It must have been tremendous. All this energy driving all these water hammers happening again and again and again, and all these shudders of the ground and flutters in the granite crust. It'd be like a constant series of globally felt earthquakes. It's just hard to even imagine what that must have been like. At the scene of the rupture itself, those 60-mile cliffs would begin to break up from the bottom upwards. And this erosion of the sides of the rupture walls, caused by the powerful upward flow of the water, would result in a constant widening of that rupture. It just keeps getting wider and wider and wider. The crack is widening, turning into a canyon and beyond. Consequently, Dr. Brown says, the 46,000-mile-long rupture rapidly grew to an average width of about 800 miles all around the Earth. About 35%, he says, of the eroded sediments were from the basalt of the chamber floor, where that gray mantle area is. Sediments swept up in the escaping floodwaters gave the water a thick, muddy consistency, and you can see that they kind of colored the water brown there to represent this. These sediments settled out over the Earth's surface in days, trapping and burying many plants and animals, beginning the process of forming the world's fossils. So in the centuries leading up to the flood, recall that tidal pumping led to the underground water going into a supercritical state. And this supercritical water began to dissolve minerals in the crust above it. Dr. Brown says the supercritical water in the subterranean chamber had also dissolved minerals containing calcium, carbon, and oxygen. They too had precipitated, or kind of like just fell down out of the supercritical water as temperatures rose, lining the chamber floor with limestone. This is happening over long periods of time. Okay, limestone is calcium carbonate, basically. Limestone particles. And as the floodwaters escaped, these particles then were also swept out and up onto the Earth's surface. The total volume of limestone on the Earth today is staggering, and it cannot be explained by processes occurring at the Earth's surface. But of course, the limestone we see today did not originate at the Earth's surface. It came from underground, and this is what his theory is explaining. So here's what's happening, okay? Water has been launched into the atmosphere during the initial rupture phase, right? And this results in the massive torrential rains falling on the same day that the fountains of the great deep broke up. The 600th year of Noah's life, the second month, the 17th day of the month. On that same day, the fountains of the great deep broke forth, and the windows of heaven were open. Rain came falling. The Bible says the windows of heaven opened up. Freezing water collapses down upon the mammoths and the other animals in their regions, freezing them solid, preserving them to be rediscovered in modern times. Water, trillions of tons of it, is also rapidly spreading across the surface of the earth and forming, starting to form the rock layers we see today, starting to form the fossil record as in those layers, as plants and animals are being swept away by the force of this water. In time, the rains subside, but the rupture continues to widen. And as it does, it's going to lead to the third stage of the Hyrdroplate Theory, the continental drift phase. As you can see in this picture, the Earth's mantle beneath the granite crust has buckled up, creating that mid-oceanic ridge that we looked at on the world map a little while ago. Or as it's called here, the mid-Atlantic ridge, because this ridge begins to buckle in the region of Earth of what is today known as our Atlantic Ocean. We're going to see how that ocean came to be. But first things first, what causes this buckling? Well, according to Dr. Brown, he says the material within the earth is compressed by overlying rock. Rock's slight elasticity gives it spring-like characteristics. The deeper the rock, the more weight above. So the more tightly compressed the spring, quote unquote, all the way down to the center of the earth. So there's energy trapped here. There's like a spring ready to, well, spring, right? The rupture path continuously widened during the flood phase. Eventually, the width was so great, and so much of the surface weight had been removed that the compressed rock beneath the exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward. To see how this works, Dr. Brown put together an illustration in his book. Here we have a spring under compression from two thumbs pushing on the ends. So that's putting the tension, the energy into that spring. The spring is being pressed down onto the gray rock foundation by these brown rock weights above it. Of course, the gray rock corresponds to the Earth's mantle. The upper brown rocks are playing the role of the Earth's granite crust in this illustration. The spring itself also should be compared to the gray rock mantle, and it's going to simulate the action of that mantle. To illustrate the widening of the rupture of the crust, we'll move the upper brown rock weights apart from each other, okay? Now it's sitting over the thumbs, not just right at the thumbs. Weight has been removed from the spring, but right now it still remains aligned but you can bet that the energy is pretty significant in that open space. And if we widen the gap even more, now enough weight is removed from the spring that it suddenly buckles up into the gap. All right, it's one of those moments where if you're pulling those things back, you're waiting for it to go bang, right? Dr. Brown says, now consider, he says, thousands of similar springs lined up behind the first spring, all linked together and repeating in unison the steps we just covered, A through C, the three pictures, right? And the upward buckling of any spring will cause adjacent springs to become unstable and buckle up themselves. So there's a whole reaction here, dominoes, right? They in turn will lift the next spring and so on in a ripple fashion. And here then is how things look with the continental drift phase of the hydroplate model. Now I know I'm reading a lot to you tonight of what Dr. Brown says, but after all, it's his theory. He explains it well, and so I like using his words. He's succinct. I might dance around it and never actually get a good illustration for you. Anyway, he writes this. The continental drift phase begins. The mid-Atlantic ridge springs upward, releasing extreme amounts of energy inherent in the compressed rock. Fracture zones form perpendicular to the ridge axis. Okay, see, and then there are rifts that form along the ridge axis. The massive hydroplates, which is now what this busted up crust is called, lubricated by water because there's still water underneath there, begin to accelerate downhill. As more and more weight slides away from the newly formed ridge, the exposed chamber floor quickly rises several miles, accelerating the hydroplates even more, and this all becomes the Atlantic floor. Now here's a good map image of that mid-Atlantic ridge between the Americas and Europe and Africa. You can see very clearly how well the west coast of Africa aligns with the eastern edge of that ridge. And the same is true with the Americas' eastern edge and the western side of the ridge. In that case, pay particularly close attention to that continental shelf along North America. It's the blue land that extends out from the yellow surface. The blue, of course, would be ordinarily below sea level, obviously. So it's not difficult at all to imagine the continents sliding away from that uprise between them and then settling where they're at. Now, I believe that the Bible is a Holy Spirit-breathed book. It's a supernatural book. It comes from outside of our time domain. And sometimes it seems that poetic writings, such as the Psalms, can have a kind of double meaning. There's the immediate context that is being talked about by the psalmist, but the Holy Spirit is using him to describe other things. In Psalm 18, for example, David is speaking to the Lord about the Lord's deliverance of David from his enemies, also especially from the hand of King Saul. Some of the language seems, however, to transcend or go beyond David's direct deliverance in his life, and it sounds very akin to the deliverance experience of Noah. It kind of puts a parallel between Noah's life and David's. Try thinking of Noah speaking here as I read this to you. Then the earth shook and trembled. The foundations of the hills also quaked and were shaken because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Coals were kindled by it. I think that imagery almost speaks of underlying volcanic action that's happening at this time. He bowed the heavens down, also rather. Think of the rainbow, right? He bowed the heavens also, and came down with darkness under his feet. And he rode upon a cherub and flew. He flew upon the wings of the wind, which the wind must have been tremendous with all this happening. He made darkness his secret place. His canopy around him was dark waters, and thick clouds of the skies. From the brightness before him his thick clouds passed with hailstones and coals of fire. Think of the mammoths up north. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent his arrows and scattered the foe, lightnings in abundance, and he vanquished them. Think of the destruction of life caused by the flood event. Then the channels of the sea were seen. The foundations of the world were uncovered at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. He sent from above, he took me. He drew me out of many waters. Pretty astounding, isn't it? Notice in this picture here, Psalm 18:15 is quoted, of this picture of the continental drift phase that we've been studying this evening. Doesn't that verse dovetail nicely with what you see in the illustration? Then the channels of water appeared, that opening gap between the busted crust, and the foundations of the world were laid bare. That mid-Atlantic ridge, and then the ultimate Atlantic floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, here's Dr. Brown's explanation for the formation of the continents as we know them today and the larger mountain ranges. He says continental plates, as you can see them there with the yellow arrows, accelerated away from the widening Atlantic. Recall that the rupture encircled the Earth, and escaping subterranean water widened that rupture to an average of about 800 miles. It was different in different areas. It wasn't 800 solid all the way around, some less and some a little bit more perhaps. On what is now the Pacific side of the Earth as well as the Atlantic side. So this is going all over the place. Plates then slid away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge and toward that 800-mile wide gap on the Pacific side of the Earth. And eventually, the hydroplates ran into resistances of two types. I want to point out to you the Pacific Ocean ridge to the left of that oncoming plate. See the direction of the continental drift on the other yellow arrow in the right? It's coming towards that Pacific Ocean ridge. The first happened as the water lubricant beneath each sliding plate was depleted. So the water is obviously gone from in between the plate and the mantle, and it's now sliding rock across rock, basically. The second occurred when a plate collided with something. As each massive hydroplate decelerated, it experienced a gigantic compression event, buckling, crushing, and thickening each plate. These are becoming the land masses we have today, the continents we have today. These things are much thicker than the ocean floor, okay? The continents are much thicker than the ocean floor, and this buckling, he says, is what led to that situation that we now have. He goes on, compressing a long, thin object such as a yardstick produces no bending or displacement until the compressive force reaches a certain critical amount, and then it starts to bend. Once this threshold is exceeded, the yardstick or any compressed beam or plate suddenly arches into a bowed position. Further compression bows it up even more. Buckling a hydroplate at one point also bends adjacent portions. Therefore, mountain chains were pushed up by the crushing of hydroplates. Where the compression exceeded the crushing strength of granite, the plate thickened and it shortened. The collapse of strength in the crushed region increased the load on adjacent regions, causing them to crush and the mountain chain to lengthen. Again, we have a kind of a domino effect going on here. Therefore, bending and crushing rapidly lifted mountain chains. Naturally, the long axis of each buckled mountain was generally perpendicular to its hydroplate's motion, that is, parallel to the portion of the mid-oceanic ridge from which it slid. So the Rocky Mountains, Appalachians, and Andes have a north-south orientation. I remember him in his illustration in the movie comparing it to a tablecloth, cloth one, of course, on a table, and you're pushing the tablecloth, not pulling it, but pushing it, and as it meets resistance, it wrinkles up. And of course, it would be parallel, roughly, to the direction in which you're pushing, right? Doesn't, actually go in line with your fingers as you're pushing. You know what I mean? It's actually cutting across your fingers, intersecting them almost as you're pushing up those wrinkles. So that's parallel to the edge of the table and the direction that you're heading. Anyway, while we're on this slide, you can see there's some other information on there that's worth talking about. I wanted to tell you about this guy. Some of the images that I've used for this subject, that I've screen captured them from YouTube videos that were done by Brian Nichol. Brian, in this case, not like my name, he spells it wrong, but no, I won't hold that against him. It's Bryan, that's how he spells it. And Nickel is spelled just like the coin, Nickel, Brian Nichol. He uploaded a number of videos about 6 or so years ago on the Hyrdroplate Theory. He does a very good job, much more in-depth study on this than what I'm doing, of course, and hours of video available there. If you are interested in this subject at all, it would really be worth checking out Brian Nichol's YouTube channel. Just search for him by name, again, Bryan, and then Nichol like the coin on YouTube, and you should be able to find his channel. And he just has a few videos on there, but they're excellently done. This continental drifting and then grinding to a halt, which Dr. Brown describes as the compression event in his theory, did produce extreme compression of the rock, which in turn produced extreme heat and extreme pressure. If I go back a slide, you can see the red areas forming there. I did mention it here. Magma forming there, that red, from friction of the halting continent as it comes to a stop. So it's melting the rock. It's that hot as it screeches to a halt. So there is extreme heat. There also is extreme pressure. The heat and pressure laid down coal and oil deposits. It also produced metamorphic rocks. That's where rocks change their form, basically, right? A metamorphosis of a caterpillar to a butterfly, right? It changes the form. Ordinary sedimentary rocks are pushed beyond their regular form into something very different. Limestone, under extreme heat and pressure, becomes marble, while coal, which is carbon-based, is turned into diamond. Evolutionary scientists claim that diamonds are 1 billion years old. Creation scientists have taken diamonds to be tested for carbon-14. If the evolutionists are correct on the age of diamonds, that they're about 1 billion years old, there should be no carbon-14 in them. But the test results coming back from the 3 standard testing labs revealed that the diamonds did indeed have C14 in them. They've tested with C14 present. Diamonds are therefore only a few thousand years old, not millions. The half-life of carbon-14, and there's not much in there to begin with, is only 5,730 years. And every time that hits, it's cut in half. And so you can only go back about maybe 10,000 years or something like that with it. And actually, I don't believe you can go back that far because there wasn't anything 10,000 years ago, in my humble opinion. But in other tests, coal and oil also had carbon-14 in them. Shouldn't have been there if that stuff's as old as they claim. The Hyrdroplate theory produced the amount of energy needed for this one-time event that could actually create coal, oil, and then diamonds from once living material, which is what carbon is. That's why Sinclair, I knew I would get it, the Sinclair oil company years ago had a dinosaur as their logo because it came from fossils. It's a fossil fuel. And similarly, Shell had a shell, which is largely what you find. And so that's where the carbon was coming from that became, and other things that became the oil, right? And although much more could be done with this theory, that is all that we're going to do this evening with Dr. Walt Brown's Hyrdroplate Theory. There's so much here. For those of you who have hung in there with me on this rather difficult material, I commend you very much. Mainly what I wanted you to see here tonight is that there are young Earth alternative ideas which provide a better explanation for the conditions that we observe on our planet today. We're under no obligation, folks, not even scientifically, all right, to adhere to any evolutionary effort to explain our reality. They're trying to explain something that they themselves have never observed, so it really falls outside of the parameters of real science. We can trust in the God who made us as well as he made the earth where we live. Praise the name of our Creator God. He gets the glory for these things. Now, next week, we will not be live streaming while live, as it's the night before Thanksgiving. So we will see you in December, Wednesday, December the 1st to be exact. So have a blessed 2 weeks, everyone, and we'll be back with something along these same lines next time.